think a good way to start is always to start in prayer. And for that, I think a good place to go is the Psalms, Psalm 19. And so we're going to pray Psalm 19 together. And if you have had me in class or have me in class, feel free to join in because you hopefully have this memorized by now. So let's pray in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows forth the work of his hands. Day unto day takes up the story, and night unto night makes known the message. No speech, no word, no voice is heard, yet their span extends through all the earth, their words to the utmost bounds of the world. There he has placed a tent for the sun. It comes forth like a bridegroom coming from his tent, rejoices like a champion to run its course. At the end of the sky is the rising of the sun. To the furthest end of the sky is its course. There is nothing concealed from its burning heat. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I didn't hear y'all. So if you have especially the current fifth graders, they're really good at this. If you just say, the heavens proclaim the glory of God, they should be able to finish the rest of that for you. And I did that with them today in class. Good. So, yes, the heavens declare the glory of God. I experienced what the psalmist is speaking about very recently on the middle school retreat last Friday. Friday evening, I brought the telescope along, and at the end of the evening, invited the middle schoolers to come on out and look at the stars. And, I teach middle schoolers. I spend time with them. I have somewhat of an idea of what they can be like, and so I was like, maybe a few of them will come. And I was so impressed with our students because, first of all, about 20, 25 of them took me up on that offer, which in and of itself was awesome, that they were just like, yeah, sure, we'll go with Mr. Harris and look at the stars. But then even more than that, as we walked out into the field where it was a little bit darker, and as we started, I invited them into a contemplative posture. I shared with them that looking at the stars is something that is best done as a contemplative action, as a contemplative practice. And so it's something that is best done in silence and quiet and stillness. And again, I teach middle schoolers. I spend a lot of time with them. So I was like, well, we'll see how this goes. And I was amazed. I was amazed and so impressed with how they took that to heart. And for the next 4 or 5 minutes, it was just dead silent. And it was really beautiful. As we sat there, some of them were laying on the ground, just looking at the stars for a while. And then from that place, I started pointing things out to them and, teaching them about some of the constellations and showing them some of the things that we'll see later this evening. But it was really beautiful. So I wanted to share with you that story because I think it encapsulates what we want to share with you tonight. Why astronomy? For me, that's kind of the question for the evening that I'll be speaking about is why astronomy? So that's my story that I think encapsulates that. And now I want to go to one of the great teachers, Plato, and share with you something that he says that I think also helps us answer that question. So this is from the dialogue Timaeus, in which one of Socrates' friends, Timaeus, is giving an account. He's given a task by Socrates of giving an account of creation, basically, of starting at the beginning and telling the story of what happened of creation up until the point of the Greeks. And so at some point in this, he starts talking about eyes, like our eyes, and how they work and stuff like that. And some of us might read that and be like, this is so silly, their science is really bad. I would argue that actually it's a lot closer to what we say today than we might think at first glance. That's another talk. After he gives this account of how the eyes work, he says, let us conclude then our discussion of the accompanying auxiliary causes that gave our eyes the power which they now possess. We must next speak of that supremely beneficial function for which the God gave them to us. As my account has it, our sight has indeed proved to be a source of supreme benefit to us, and that none of our present statements about the universe could ever have been made if we had never seen any stars, sun, or heaven. As it is, however, our ability to see the periods of day and night, of months and of years, of equinoxes and solstices, has led to the invention of number, and has given us the idea of time and opened the path to inquiry into the nature of the universe. These pursuits have given us philosophy, a gift from the gods to the mortal race, whose value neither has been nor ever will be surpassed. I'm quite prepared to declare this to be the supreme good of our eyesight. Why then should we exalt all the lesser good things, which a non-philosopher struck blind would lament and bewail in vain? Let us rather declare that the cause and purpose of this supreme good is this. The God invented sight and gave it to us so that we might observe the orbits of intelligence in the universe and apply them to the revolutions of our own understanding. For there is a kinship between them. Even though our revolutions are disturbed, whereas the universal orbits are undisturbed. So once we have come to know them and to share in the ability to make correct calculations according to nature, we should stabilize the straying revolutions within ourselves by imitating the completely unstraying revolutions of the God. So as I said, my task for the next few minutes that I have until I have to hand off the mic is to ask and propose somewhat of an answer to the question, why astronomy? Why should we study astronomy? Why do we teach our seniors astronomy? Why does Mr. Nicol teach our third graders astronomy? And then why do we teach our seniors astronomy as the culmination of their scientific studies? And I think a secondary question to this is also why ancient and classical astronomy? If you talk to one of the seniors, they'll tell you that so far, we will talk about this stuff in the spring, but we haven't talked about any of the things that you would normally find in most astronomy classes. The astronomy class that I took in high school, we talked about the sun being made of hydrogen and helium and nuclear fusion and black holes and supernova and all of that, which we will talk about in the spring. But we haven't talked about any of that yet. We started with the Greeks, well, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Arab astronomers of the 8th to 12th centuries, and then the medieval Latin culture. So to answer this question, first I'm going to take us back to our predecessors in our endeavor of classical education, and starting with the Greeks and Romans, and then the medieval classical education structure that developed from that. And in classical education, in the medieval model of education, there was these kind of two introductory courses of studies called the trivium and the quadrivium. Right. And in the trivium, you found grammar and then logic and rhetoric. So grammar is teaching you the structure of language, the structure of just things, not just language in terms of the words, but of things. Logic is helping you to learn to speak about them in a way that is reasonable, a way that is ordered, to develop a coherent argument, and also to see, analyze, examine what others are saying. And then rhetoric is teaching you to present that argument, to present what you're saying in a beautiful way. That's kind of the basic summary of those. And then after you completed that course of studies, you would move on to arithmetic. I don't think I'm spelling that right. Arithmetic, geometry, and music. And then finally, astronomy. And this course of studies is all about number. Arithmetic is number, learning how numbers work. When you move on to geometry, you start thinking about numbers in space, right? Shapes. So that's number in space. Music is number in time. Mrs. Turner and I, who have talked a little bit about this. Mrs. Turner is the director of fine arts here. We've been talking a little bit lately about how music and math are so related, because music is math in time, right? Math that you can listen to, and we can hear the beauty of it, and it can touch our souls. After you study music and time, number and time, you move on to number in time and space. Right? So that would be classically what astronomy is conceived of, is number in time and space. Right? I can see mathematics at work looking at the heavens because I can see the patterns that are present there, the shapes that are present there, and how they move through time or over time. Okay. So this is kind of what we've inherited, our forerunners in the endeavor of classical education. But I don't think it's good enough for us to just say, well, we do it because this is what they did, so we should end with astronomy too, because they ended with astronomy, right? Because what they did was perfect, so we should just do it. It was pretty good, but I think we need to also ask the question of, like, well, why did they do that, and should we still do that, and what was the point? And so that is, I think, where I take us back to the psalmist and to what I read from Plato here. The goal of this course of studies is not just to be able to get a good job, go to good college, get a good job, and do useful things, make stuff, produce stuff, and consume stuff. But it's rather to open our hearts and our minds to true wisdom and to deeper truths. Astronomy, as both Plato and the psalmist have told us, can do that in a really powerful way. As we look at the heavens, our hearts are opened to marvel at the beauty and the order that God has placed in the world. Right? Our hearts are opened to higher things, and we also learn to think about them. As we start looking at the heavens, thinking about the heavens, learning to, as Plato says, make correct calculations about them, as I've done this over the past year, since I've been teaching astronomy, started doing that, I already looked at the stars some. I would go out every once in a while and be like, oh, hey, cool. But over the past year, there's... It's true. That's what I would do. And I would try to find, identify some constellations. But there's been something that's happened in my own heart over the past year as I started to do that even more and start to try to figure out what's happening. And I had to learn how things are moving in a way that I wasn't familiar with. I knew the basic idea of everything's up there is turning. But as I studied it last year in preparation to teach the course this year, and then in teaching our course, doing that has opened my own heart in a way to that beauty and order that God has placed in our world. And it's opened my heart to the story and the message that the psalmist speaks of when he says, the heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament shows forth the work of his hands. Day unto day takes up this story. And it's opened my heart to that story, which the psalmist is speaking of the order and the beauty that God has placed in our world. And it brings order to my own heart, like Plato, like Timaeus says in what I read earlier. Right? He tells us that this study of astronomy, both the act of going to look at the stars, marveling at them, looking at them, but also, as we do in our astronomy class, learning to make calculations about them, doing the hard work of having to build in your head a model of what's happening and be able to make predictions or calculations. Doing that hard work stabilizes, this is what Plato tells us, stabilizes the straying revolutions within ourselves. Right? We all know that there's something in our hearts that is unstable, that is adrift, that wants to take us away from what is good, wants to take us away from order, wants to take us away from reason. And by studying astronomy, we're drawn back into the order of the universe, the order that God has placed there, the goodness that he has placed there. Right? And it reminds us of his goodness, and also can help us to reflect that goodness in our own hearts. It can help us to stabilize those straying revolutions within ourselves in imitation of the unstraying revolutions that we see in the heavens. And so I'm preparing to hand off to Mr. Mueller. But my last thing there, I hope my goal here is to answer that question of why astronomy somewhat. I haven't necessarily addressed the second question specifically of why do we study ancient and classical astronomy before we move into the modern astronomy in the spring. But my hope was, in what I've said, you've got some idea of that. Because I think that just learning about nuclear fusion and hydrogen and helium and black holes and star death and all that, while it's really fascinating, there's something that can't do for us, that having to build a model in my mind of how things are moving so that when I step outside, I can see, oh, look, Venus, Saturn, Jupiter, the moon, and that's all going to turn like this. And so when we step out there in a few moments, it will all have turned like this. And that means that the axis is over there and the North Star is over there. So building that model in my mind is something that a lot of modern astronomy can't do for us. And so starting here opens our hearts to wonder in a way that I wasn't exposed to in my own high school astronomy class. And so that's where Mr. Mueller's going to kind of jump off, is what are the things that we can learn from the ancients? What did they not actually think that people think that they thought? What did they think that shows us they were actually really, really smart? And what can we gain from their model, their vision of the universe? So, Mr. Mueller.
I have a piece of paper in front of me entitled "The Manifold Falsehoods and Common Misconceptions Perpetuated About Cosmologies and Astronomical Systems of Sundry Ancients and Medievals." So, fear not. No. So this is really important, actually, for answering Mr. Harris's second question. I hope you got a glimpse of why astronomy, period, right? But why astronomy in the way that we do it here? When I was initially designing the course for the 12th grade, I knew that we had to seek something that contemporary astronomy doesn't really have. And who am I to do that? No one, in fact. But I did notice that there was an area of astronomy about which tremendous falsehoods were being perpetuated. And they are probably falsehoods and misconceptions that you grew up hearing and may still think, actually. So if I say something upsetting, please don't hurt me tonight. But about the medieval and classical period, there are many myths, and this is in fact what they turn out to be when you study the history of these periods. And so I wanted to recount a few of those for you by way of setting up, okay, let's think about some misconceptions, let's get rid of them, and then let's think about what the medievals and the ancients were actually up to. And what can that do for us that contemporary astronomy and astrophysics, as astonishing as it is, can't quite do? And I'll just go ahead and say from the outset, contemporary astronomy and astrophysics rather intentionally leaves out entire realms of the human experience and of the cosmos. We leave out theology. We leave out a moral dimension of consideration of the cosmos. And you might be thinking, well, of course, those aren't scientific. They don't belong there. Aha. But are they true? And if things can be truly sought theologically and poetically and morally, if there is in fact goodness, truth, and beauty that moves the universe, that moves the sun and the furthest stars, then we should find a model that brings these things together. And the medievals had such a model. They incorporated the best science of their day, which, contrary to popular belief these days, was quite good. But they also incorporated theology with Dante and others, incorporated poetry, incorporated the ethical dimension. So, first, I want to talk about a few myths that you may or may not have heard up to this point in your life. The first one, the most common one, is that the ancients and medievals believed that the earth was flat. But they did not. Is this still on there? Yes. Okay. This is a wonderful illustration. It's actually just a 17th century engraving of this particular pilgrim, I think in Germany, who claimed that he had found the place where the earth actually touches the sky and had been able to kind of stick his head up out of it and had a kind of vision. So this was one quirky dude. I don't know exactly what he saw, but this has been taken to be indicative of entire medieval cosmology. In 2019, because of this whole flat earth scare that has been happening, it's true. CNN published an article on the modern flat earth movement featuring this engraving, which is called the Flammarion engraving, with an inaccurate caption, and the caption was this: a medieval engraving of a scientist leaving the world, representing the change in conceptions of the world in the 16th century. So CNN, whoever wrote this, had this very grand, this is representing the moment of scientific progress, the moment when we shook off the nasty religious coils of the world and started to think about science, the real truth for the first time. And this would be a delightfully meaningful image if it were anything like the truth. But, in fact, despite the most nefarious intellectual sting operation in the history of mankind, which I will call the myth of the flat earth, it is verifiably the case that almost no educated person, and I promise you this, no educated person from 5th century BC onwards, at least in the West, but generally speaking, I'm not as familiar with Eastern astronomy, Chinese and Japanese, but my understanding is that it's very similar in this way. No one believed that the earth was flat. The notion is always tempting for the layperson because, for all appearances, we don't at any given moment appear to be standing on the surface of an oblate spheroid that is both spinning madly and hurtling in orbit through the starry heavens, right? That doesn't look like what's happening. Recognizing this, philosophers like Aristotle gave common sense observations in addition to help. So they had their philosophical arguments, but those were kind of dense. And so Aristotle was like, okay, there are some crazy people who come up from time to time who think that the earth is flat. Here's how you can deal with them. And so he handed out just some common sense proofs. And the minute you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, right. So the first one is the argument from the lunar eclipse, which if you want to stay up between 1 and 4 a.m. tonight, you could see. And if you saw the lunar eclipse, you would slowly see what shape of shadow creeping its way over the moon? You're right, a very flat, straight shadow. No, it is a crescent-shaped shadow. And Aristotle says it is a crescent-shaped shadow that slowly covers the moon because the earth itself is a sphere. You can also observe this by, if you're able to travel to different locations of latitude. So if we're thinking about, let's say that this is one side of the curvature of the earth, and Aristotle says, well, hey, if you hang out here, you'll see a certain set of stars. But if you were to travel down to Africa, you'd be able to see different stars. That means that the surface that we're on is curved, because as you make your way up, you can see constellations over in the horizon that you wouldn't have been able to see in the north if you go as far south. And so therefore, the surface that we're on is curved. And he took the conjecture from there to say that it is spherical. He also made the argument from what can be observed with sailing ships coming towards you over the horizon. If a ship is sailing towards you over the horizon, which part of it do you see first? The mast, the very top of the mast. And slowly, more of the ship will be revealed. You don't just see a tiny speck and then see, aha, the ship, right? And so all of these things, Aristotle said, look, this contributes to an understanding that we should have that the Earth's surface is curved, but we should follow that to its conclusion that it is a sphere. He also had an argument from the existence of elephants in both southern Africa and southern India, and said that that somehow proved that the Earth was a sphere. I think he sort of had some continental drift in mind, but I'm not sure. There's this wonderful book that we teach from in the 12th grade, and James Evans, the author, also at that point says, he says, look, the first three are totally convincing. Who knows about the elephants, right? So, it really wasn't even an open question amongst at least astronomers, right? It's kind of like saying, well, nobody today believes that the Earth is flat, but we all know that that's not true, right? It's confounding, but but there it is. So I'm not going to say nobody believed it, but certainly those who studied astronomy, when we follow the academic record and the intellectual history, did not believe it. Even Homer refers to the surface of the Earth as that of a concave shield. Now, did he have a whole sphere in mind? I don't know. But he at least recognizes the curvature, and Aristotle takes that through to a conclusion. Myth number 2. The ancients and medievals believed in an anthropocentric, that is to say, self-centered universe. They thought man was the most important thing. And I don't know how this one made its way into the nasty fingers of history, but it is in fact not the case. So what is the case is that they did think, usually, that the universe was geocentric, but it's a particular kind of geocentrism where you have to envision that the Earth is at the center, but they also believed that the Earth was of completely negligible size in comparison with the universe. So not large, not half the size of the universe, not larger than the other planets per se. It was of negligible size. That is to say, pretty much the size of a point in comparison with the celestial sphere, which is where the fixed stars are, but we'll get to that in a moment. So Aristotle says that the Earth is spherical, but it's because all matter, all lowly, all base things collect at the center. And from there, every direction that you can possibly go is up, because it's out towards the better things, right? So what is innermost in the universe for Aristotle is base, right? Now the medievals take that, the medieval Christians take that a bit farther and say, aha, it is base because of the fall. That is where we are, so the sinful humans, and so we are part of that which is base and that which needs to move towards what is good. And so this is a little schematic here of Dante's universe. So far from thinking that a geocentric universe means that man is self-centered, we should see that it means that all of the worst things are collected where we are. And, and that the further you ascend through the heavenly spheres, the sphere of the moon, Mercury, Mars, Venus, and so forth, you eventually get to the Empyrean heaven. And that's where God is, right? Myth number 3. They assumed geocentrism because of ignorance. I don't want to dwell on this one too long, but the first heliocentric model was proposed by Hipparchus of Nicaea in the 2nd century BC. The problem is, it just didn't make any sense of what you could see. The math worked, but here's the problem. Geocentrism persists because pretty much for the life of any given astronomer, the math also works. This sounds strange, but we only noticed the gap in understanding over centuries as astronomers handed down observations generation to generation, and you have people in 7th century Saudi Arabia using Ptolemy, 2nd century AD, and even some of Hipparchus's observations, and noticing it breaks down. It breaks down because of the precession of the equinoxes, which is a tricky thing to understand. So in the model that we hold today, what is actually the case is the Earth is rotating, right? But it's also orbiting around the sun. And it is at the same time, if you imagine that this is the axis of the Earth, it's at a tilt, and it's also wobbling just a little bit, which means if it weren't wobbling, I don't think anyone would have ever noticed. And we'd all be geocentrists today. But it is wobbling because the axis is shifting just a little bit. It's actually describing a giant circle somewhere, we have to imagine up in the heavens, and that circle takes 25,000 years to go all the way around. It's referred to as the Great Year because it's like one conceptual year, the same way that in our orbit around the sun, we count that as 1 year, right? That wobble means that astronomers, who were looking at 400-year-old observations started to think, but that's not where Polaris should be. It should be ever so slightly over there. The observations were getting thrown off, but imagine how precise you have to be to begin to notice that kind of discrepancy. It's astonishing. Hipparchus, the one who proposed heliocentrism in the first place, was also the first one to propose a precession of the equinoxes. And that was in the 2nd century BC. And it takes, so Ptolemy accepts the precession of the equinoxes, develops a theory of epicycles to account for how we can make the math work. And it holds for like 100 years. And then we keep having to tweak it, but still assuming geocentrism. It gets tweaked every 150 to 200 years with kind of a semi-major overhaul because the math just isn't quite working. It's off a little bit. But by way of saying it wasn't from ignorance that geocentrism was assumed. There was a desire to have the math, the theory, match what we could actually see, right? Number 4, I need to move faster. The medieval church was anti-science and anti-technology. To any historian, this claim seems not only patently false, but a little bit insane. The church had a leading hand in building pretty much all of the great universities of the medieval period, and these were places where, of course, astronomy and medicine, in addition to the other liberal arts, were studied. The church, I think if you track down any particular story, even that of Galileo, that famed hero of Carl Sagan, the church is anti-heresy, not anti-science. Unless we think that there's no interesting technology until the telescope, you should look up the astrolabe, which is a 2-dimensional handheld computer, essentially, upon which a 3-dimensional conceptual version of the celestial sphere is projected. And so you can use the astrolabe to do things like tell the time of day or night, anytime. You can use it to find the exact position, like exact degrees of any of the bright stars in the night sky. And in fact, a skillful, medieval astronomer would have been able to use an astrolabe for about 600 to 700 discrete functions in about the amount of time, actually, that it would take me to Google something on my phone. Like, how many degrees above the horizon is Venus right now? You could find that out with your astrolabe in about 10 seconds. It's pretty cool. Number 5, the medieval period was a dark age, especially when compared with classical Greece and Rome, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Carl Sagan famously said, "Those years were dismissed as a millennium gap, a poignant lost opportunity for the human species." This all seems to come from writing directly post-Enlightenment, where there seems to be this very energetic effort to cast aspersion on everything that came before. This is where we invent for the first time the myth that everyone believed that the earth was flat in the ancient and medieval world. Manel, a French scientist at the time, referred to the 12 centuries of the Middle Ages as a profound night. And in such works as On the Cosmological Opinions of the Church Fathers, sought to discredit, basically just make everyone who came before, the year 1600 something look quite foolish, right? As if no truth had been pursued in the scientific realm. Nothing could be further from the truth. And if you want to read a bit more on this, there's a recent book called The Light Ages by a Cambridge scholar named Seb Falk. And it's well worth reading. Okay, I promise I'll go fast, Mr. Nicol. So much for what they did not believe. But what did they believe, in brief? C.S. Lewis describes a clear difference between a modern and medieval conception in The Discarded Image. And he says this: the fundamental concept of modern science is, or was until very recently, that of natural laws, and every event was described as happening in obedience to them. In medieval science, the fundamental concept was that of certain sympathies, of antipathies, of strivings inherent to matter itself. Everything has its right place, its home, the region that suits it. If not forcibly restrained, it moves thither by an almost homing instinct. And this is from Chaucer. Every kindly thing that is hath a kindly stead, there he may best in it conserved be, unto which place everything, through his kindly inclining, moveth for to come to. So, in case the Middle English is not your thing, he's basically saying everything, every material and immaterial thing, has the place where it belongs, the place where it wants to be. The rock falls to the earth in this model because it wants to be there. Now, lest we sort of think, like, what are you saying? Like, rocks are sentient and they have feelings and they want to go to the earth because it's their buddy. Lewis points out that the medieval thinker could easily just come back at you and say, like, oh, what, do you think things are sentient and in fact even smarter, and they listen to laws and they obey them like citizens, your laws of gravity and that kind of thing? The point is, our model of language is even a bit more anthropomorphic. It assigns more sophistication to matter than even the medievals did, with this idea of sympathy, of striving, of trying to get the place that you belong, right? And this old language continually suggests a sort of continuity between merely physical events and our most spiritual aspirations. I'll just briefly show. This is a sort of split apart model of the universe as it would have been envisioned by the medievals. Notice again the spherical Earth. And you see the rings of the different spheres. Those of the planets that eventually make their way up to God, but also through which God directs all of creation. So for the medieval Christians, the planets could exert an influence. But we shouldn't get scared immediately and think like, astrology, witchcraft, because that stuff was always condemned by the church, right? We didn't admit anything that either allowed for prediction or determinism, or something that negated free will. But the medieval Christians were different in this respect. They said, well, in the same way that it kind of depends on who your parents are, that might have an impact on your personality, the planets could have an influence on that too. They might, but need not, was typically how it was thought of. And this might sound so strange to us that we can't accept it. They thought of it as a hierarchical governance. God working down through the levels of his creation, all the way down to you, and making you exactly who you were supposed to be, and putting you in a position to choose to move towards ascent again. There's a lot more. One final difference. We've been sort of permanently impacted by this idea of cold, dark, vacuous space. And the medievals, if from any book that we can find, never thought of it that way. In the modern mind, there's a kind of disturbing element to, like, who knows what's out there in the eternal silence, in the eternal dark. For the medievals, it was all light, and it was all music, because all of the spheres in the happy climes where the sun never closes his eye were constantly in motion. And when they are in motion, see music in space and number in space and time, they are singing. And for the medieval Christians, they are singing to the glory of God. So, we can't go back. That is the way of things. It would be like proposing that we all go back to riding horses to address the ills of modern transportation. We have to deal with the best of the science of our day. But I would propose with all my heart that we need a new model, one that incorporates and does not neglect theology, poetry, the ethical dimension. In short, that doesn't neglect beauty. A model of the cosmos that suggests harmony between creator and creation and draws us further up and further in. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mr. Nicol.
This talk is in part going to be about struggles with technology. So coming from where we've been talking about why astronomy, talking about astronomy of the ancients, I want to briefly address, as we are about to go out and do some astronomy ourselves, some of the unique hurdles that we face in our particular moment in doing astronomy, and hopefully, if we're very, very lucky, provide some glimpse of a path forward through those hurdles. We'll see. When I was growing up, one of my most voraciously consumed book series, which somehow has not yet made it into our great books curriculum, but you know, I'm plugging for it, is the somewhat inaccurately titled trilogy, as in 5.5 books, of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you have not had the distinct privilege to encounter this towering masterpiece of British literature, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a little bit like the Dune saga if it were told by Monty Python's Flying Circus. It features such things as learning to fly by tripping and then forgetting to hit the ground, or an invisibility device is called the SEP, which involves taking a spaceship and making it so unspeakably tacky that anyone's brains just don't want to see it, and so we filter it out. And in one of the later books in this series, then the protagonists visit this planet that is shrouded in a cloud of dust. And they go on the planet, and they're like bopping around, seeing the people, and they notice that this weird thing, that whenever people are singing love songs, because that's what you do when you land on a planet, is you go see how they sing their love songs, they don't sing about, oh, you know, meeting your lover under the moon or under the stars. It's all next to the tree and above the grass. Because since they're shrouded in this cloud of dust, they have no conception of a world beyond their own. And this somehow struck me as the silliest thing in this entire book. Now, I was reading it when I was growing up in rural New Hampshire. Our nearest neighbor was, I don't know, a mile away, 2 miles away. You know, you send up a smoke signal if you need help. It was very dark there. The heavens were inescapable. The moon was inescapable. A few years ago, the National Park Service made an estimate that in the continental United States, there would be no places with truly dark skies by the year 2025. If you're counting, that's about 3 years from now. I've heard since then that some people have looked at things and say, hey, I think that's incorrect. I think there are no truly dark skies right now. If you go to, say, Bryce Canyon National Park, it's absolutely gorgeous, beautiful, beautiful place to be. The brightest thing in the sky on the average night is not Sirius, it's not Betelgeuse, it's not even usually the moon, it is Las Vegas, which is 200 miles away. In the words of the astronomer Tyler Nordgren, 400 years ago, everyone in Florence could see the stars, but only Galileo had a telescope. Now, everyone has a telescope, but no one can see the stars. We who live in Houston, the space capital of the world, are almost entirely cut off from the heavens. I am so excited to go out with you in a few minutes and see what we can out there, but we are only going to be able to see the most brilliantly, blindingly bright things in the night sky. And that's an important thing to remember. We know so much about the structure and the material and the patterns of the stars, more than ever before. We have dazzling arrays of facts about the forms and movements of hundreds, if not thousands, of individual asteroids flying around through our solar system. We have mathematical models of space and time that can point us to such beautiful things as Einstein's cross, or gravitational waves. We can build detectors for gravitational waves, which apparently there have been a whole bunch of recently, from black holes crashing into each other really, 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 really far away. We know about black holes. We have pictures of black holes, which came out, 3 years ago, and all of my students think they're like very passé now. Like, yeah, black holes, yeah, we've seen black holes. They're great. We live in a post-Hubble world where you can have glossy color photographs of Jupiter that could fill up this wall, and nebulae that would blow your mind. We have ideas of the universe that at our fingertips, that our fingertips themselves are made of the universe, that we are forged from elements, forged in the hearts of stars. And somehow with all of this, there's sort of two common takeaways that people have, one or the other. One is utter disinterest in the stars. You see, like, oh man, I saw a really cool picture of Jupiter. That was pretty colors. I just made some pretty colors here too. Hooray, pretty colors. Doesn't matter, stop looking at the stars. The other is utter disinterest in ourselves. Say, if you understood the stars, you would understand that you are utterly insignificant and do not matter if you just looked up there. I think both of these ideas come from the same place. It has always been true in the past that we think the same things and tell the same stories about the stars that we think and we tell about ourselves. It's still true. When the story that we tell about the stars and ourselves is an entirely pragmatic and material one, we become either vastly more important ourselves because proximity, or vastly less importance because, sheer metric mass. We weigh like this much, they weigh like that much. And the fact that we are cut off from the vision of the heavens themselves, the thing that throughout everywhere on Earth, throughout all of history, has been one of the primary points of inspiration for wonder, for awe, for understanding beauty, for contemplating our place in the cosmos and our relationship to it. The fact that we cannot see that means that we're severed from one of the main reasons to counter the narrative that we have about ourselves. In Jacob Hogarth's 2016 essay, Missing the Night Sky, which is great. You should look it up. It's a fun read. It's very depressing. He argues that this is a feature and not a bug of the entire technological project of the last few hundred years. He says, quote, "What was special about the desire for light in the early modern era was that its advocates conceived of a kingdom of darkness as vulnerable not only to spiritual and intellectual forces, but chiefly to the technological arts, and as ultimately conquerable by them. The cultural value of the Starry Night is that it confronts us with the reality that our powers over nature and our insights into its inner workings are really quite limited, not only in themselves, but also against the backdrops of other kinds of knowledge. Sure, our telescopes see farther than our eyes ever could, but our natural vision is now restricted mostly to a small sphere over which we have control. I'll say his overall argument here is one that I like to flirt with and can't really accept totally, because I think if I totally accept it, then the only responsible thing will be for me to go and live in a cave and eat only raw meat and berries, and I haven't done that yet, so if I ever disappear, that's what happened. But I do think that considering the impact of the technological project and how we do astronomy through it is the right place to start with thinking how we find our way forward. Every technology that we have encourages its users to act in certain ways. And so every new technology we have sort of changes us and who we are and how we behave in the world. And that's not a bad thing, necessarily. Think of technologies like the table. The table is a great technology, and I'm glad we have it. It brings people together. If you say, hey, we're going to gather in a room, like, oh, we've got a table, let's come together around the table. It has probably transformed the way that we deal with food. Food isn't just a biological necessity, unless you're really busy and only eat drive-through, as happens sometimes. There's a rich tradition and rich ritual that surround coming together for food over a table. I don't know what the world would be like if no one had invented tables. We probably wouldn't have that. Maybe we'd have something totally else. I just can't imagine. Maybe we'd have like rituals involving dance and food, and that would be really cool, and we'd be really sad if we switched to this world. But like it changed how we behave, and it's in good ways. The electric light is an incredible benefit to society as well. And if you've gotten to this point, you're like, oh, you're going to advocate for abolishing the electric light. That's not what I'm doing. I promise. It's very good, even if we can't see the sky at all. It's letting us do this whole thing that we're doing right now. It helps make everybody safer. The world's a safer place now that we've got lights that we can turn on. Probably fewer Christmas trees catch on fire. Or maybe more. No, well, you had candles before on there. That seems like a really bad idea. I don't know. But the ease and inexpense of electric lights encourage us to dictate our daily lives by our moment-to-moment whims, leading to predictably detrimental results. Everybody knows that. I always think like, oh boy, I can stay up for another half hour. It'll be fine. There will be no problems in my life because I stayed up too late tonight. Ha ha. So the responsible use of light is not a rejection of it. It's finding a path for appropriately moderated usage of it. Speaking in terms of behavioral nudges for technology, the telescope, we're all coming to the telescope because we're going to go outside and have telescopes. That's what I'm talking about secretly. The telescope is sort of in a different class of thing that we should think about a little differently. For most of us, the problem with telescopes is not that we have to exercise moderation in the amount of time that we spend looking through them. I'm pointedly not making eye contact with my wife right now. It's a thing of considering how does it encourage us to behave in respect to the stars. And don't get me wrong, I'm not here to abolish electric light. And I'm a big advocate for telescopes. I brought a telescope that I own today so that we can look at the stars and we can look at specific things. But that's the potential danger, the potential temptation of telescopes, is to bring you to, oh, what's the cool thing I want to see? Hey, let's go look at Jupiter. Jupiter's awesome. It's beautiful. I hope you all get to see Jupiter. You get to see the moons of Jupiter, change the world, get to see the rings of Saturn, hoorah. It's really easy to get stuck into, that's the thing that I came here to see, and only that is the thing that I came here to see. On its own, this hyper-focus on individual objects of interest gives, at best, a messy and disjointed story of the heavens. It gives a collection of cool facts about one planet, maybe an isolated story about a constellation, a beautiful bit of astrophotography of a nebula. It's cool to hear about, it's neat to do, but what we end up with is a heap of fragments that are entirely isolated from the human story. So I'll finish here, magic words, I'm about to finish. I'll finish here by suggesting to you a brief image of a different way to think about things. And then I'm going to suggest, here's sort of practically how it's going to work when we go outside. A different way to approach the stars. It is going to be very brief because I actually wrote in my notes, because we've gone way over time. Haha, how could I have foreseen this? And really should get outside. But it's also going to be brief because you can't grasp it in a single night. The story of the stars is one that unfolds over the year and over the years. It's a thing that, as Mr. Harris talked about, you gain by going regularly, tracking the planets, tracking the stars, tracking the heavens. So I'm going to read a tiny little bit from Aratus's, I've never had to say that out loud before, Phenomena, which is a magnificent, wonderful ancient poem that traces through all of the constellations in the sky. It is absolutely beautiful and incredible and wonderful, and it's mostly very practical. But I want to read the little bit about Capricorn, which is a constellation that's like right there right now, and we are not going to see it because it doesn't have any very bright stars in it. Yeah, we'll see about where it is. It has a bright thing in it, just not in it. Round the horse that prances in the sky range two fishes, and besides its head there stretches the right hand of the water pourer who rises after Capricorn. So the horse here is Pegasus, which we'll probably be able to pick out the square Pegasus. The two fishes is Pisces, the water pourer Aquarius, who rises after Capricorn. And Capricorn, for his part, is set further ahead and lower down, where the mighty sun turns back again. And this is about how through the year, the sun, it goes across the sky here, and then it goes across the sky there, and it goes across the sky there, and each day it's going lower and lower and lower and lower and lower until the winter solstice, when it's at its lowest point. And then it turns and starts working its way back up again through the year. And when it's in there, then the sun is inside of Capricorn. And Capricorn, for his part, is set further ahead and lower down, where the mighty sun turns his back again. In that month, do not expose yourself to a battering from the waves by venturing out into open sea. Neither will you make much progress in the course of the day, because the days pass all too quickly then. Nor will dawn come soon if you are overcome by fear at night, in spite of all your cries. Dreadful are the south winds that come rushing down at that time, when the sun enters Capricorn, and worse still, the frost that descends from the sky to the sailor benumbed with cold. Yet all the same, the sea surges beneath the ship's keels throughout the year, and like diving seagulls, we keep peering around at the sea from the ships on which we are set, with our face turned toward the shore. But the wave-beaten strand is still far off, and only a thin plank of wood keeps death at bay. I love this section as a way of thinking about the constellations. In order to try to capture something about Capricorn, we start out by saying, okay, well, here's where it is in the sky, here are the things that it's next to, and saying, here's how it's related to a thing that moves throughout the year, and then here's how that time of the year affects things on Earth, here's how the seasons go, into like practical life advice, like, look, it's stormy in winter, don't go out in the sea in winter, and then goes back from there into relationship with the stars, and then into this message of hope and striving and human nobility. This is a picture of what finding the story of the stars looks like. It's different the more you study them. The more your telescopes help you see things about those constellations, doesn't change this story, though. It deepens it. And so I'm going to send you all outside to do that in a second. But I'm going to tell you, we're going to go out, and we've got telescopes, at least one telescope, maybe more telescopes, 2 telescopes. Hoorah. Yes. And I have intentionally not set mine up yet. Because when we go out, yeah, we're going to look at cool stuff. But the first thing I want you to do is look at the heavens as a whole. Spend some time doing that, because I won't have a telescope up yet. Now, to help you doing that, it's a good thing just to do, but it's helpful to have a little bit of a map. So I've printed out a whole bunch of sky charts that are targeted for about 15 minutes ago. It won't be very changed. You'll just think like, oh, things that are in the west will be a little farther down in the west, and things, there might be some things that are in the east that we can't see yet, and you just kind of shift everything over in your brain a little bit. But it's got a bunch of constellations. It's got cool stuff. You'll look at it. We'll talk to you about it. I also, because it's a full moon tonight, have a map of the moon that I just grabbed off of NASA. It says October 16th, 2021, but fortunately the moon looks, sort of the same as it did a month ago. So look at the moon. Start learning the geography of the moon. I'll see you all outside.